I'm Todd Sanders. I'm President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Chamber. We appreciate you joining us for today's webinar featuring U.S. Congressman David Schweikert. I'd like to begin by thanking today's sponsors who continue to demonstrate their strong commitment to the Chamber, our community, and our country. A virtual round of applause for APS, SRP, and Fennemore Craig for their support. As you all know, today's discussion with one of our top elected leaders is very important for our business community and our community in general. Amid a global pandemic, it's never been more important for our business community to be connected to our state, city, and federal lawmakers as we make decisions that impact all of us. As your chamber, we're committed to ensuring that your voice is heard at all levels of government. Many of you joined us for our webinars with Senator McSally and Congressman Stanton earlier this month. As you all know, in the past few weeks, there has been many more developments. And so we're thrilled to have Congressman Schweikert here with us this afternoon to give us the briefing on the latest. So Congressman, thank you for your time today and for your strong leadership on a national level. We also have Jennings, who is the Executive Director, Western Region for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who's joining us to share some insights into the work the U.S. Chamber is doing on behalf of businesses nationwide. And it is a tremendous effort, so we're thrilled to have him here as well. To quickly review today's agenda, we'll begin with remarks from our presenting sponsor, SRP. We'll hear from our guest of honor, Congressman Schweikert, and then we'll welcome Jennings from the U.S. Chamber to share some comments before we get into some Q&A. And so you can see there's a Q&A box on the side of your screen. We'll attempt to get through as many as possible. If you have them now, start sending them in, or as the Congressman delivers his remarks, go ahead and send those in, and I'll try and get to as many as possible. So with that, we can move on now. It's my privilege to introduce Renee Eastman, who's the Senior Director of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs for our sponsor, SRP, to share some remarks and to introduce our guest of honor. Renee, take it away.
Thank you, Todd. On behalf of SRP, we're pleased to be today's presenting sponsor, and thank you to the Greater Phoenix Chamber. You all do a fantastic job hosting and organizing these webinars. The COVID-19 crisis is far-reaching. At SRP, we are committed to taking every step possible to make sure that we continue to deliver water and power to our customers. We are working to protect our frontline workers and all of our employees. We have suspended disconnections for customers who are in need and struggling to pay their bills. And our board recently approved $1.25 million to support local organizations to assist small businesses and customers during this crisis. More work is ahead. And today we're going to hear from Congressman Schweikert about some of what is ahead on the federal level. Arizona, we're so fortunate to have Congressman Schweikert in Congress at this time. He serves on the prestigious Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over all of tax policy. And of course, this is a time where it's important as Congress is drafting and passing legislation to address economic stimulus and economic recovery. Few members understand and know the tax code, as well as Congressman Schweikert. And I can guarantee you, very few of them keep the most recent copy of the Joint Committee on Taxation report around just for their reading leisure, and as the Congressman does. In addition to his love of tax policy, he has firsthand experience running a small business. And of course, his service, both at the legislature and as treasurer of Maricopa County, is going to serve him well. And it's a rare combination of experience and perspective that's going to be very handy in the coming months. And Congressman, thank you so much for your leadership and for all that you do to make sure Arizona is well represented. And on a personal note, I hope everything is going well at home with you and Joyce, and most importantly, that you're getting to spend some wonderful family time with your beautiful daughter, Olivia. Thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Now, is this the moment I'm supposed to start talking?
So yeah, we'll turn it over to you, Congressman. Thank you.
And Renee,
that was my bad. I couldn't unmute.
You know, Renee keeps waking up. Excuse me. My little girl keeps waking up, looking at me, going, "Daddy, why are you still here?" Which makes you feel very special. All right. And look, am I the only one who's seriously thinking taking up heavy drinking? Oh, come on. That was funny. I hear all the cool kids do it. All right. Back to some seriousness. I actually wanted to do part of this conversation, some federal issues, some of the things we're doing here at the state level as a congressional office, and then a more tricky conversation. How do those of us who are on this call, how do we sort of help provide input to the governor's office, to some of the municipal leaders, that we're doing things proper for both the economy and also for health? So let's do a little quick conversation of the inbound I've been getting. Like earlier today, we had a Ways and Means conference call, both Republicans and Democrats, with Secretary Mnuchin. We had one earlier in the day on trade policy with Lighthouser with the Republicans. So there's a lot of things going on, trying to figure out what's the next step. What else should we do? Steny Hoyer, the majority leader for the Democrats who run the House, canceled our coming back next week. So we still don't know when the House is reconvening. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of policy ideas. And here's where we're having a bit of vigorous discussion. Is the next phase, call it the fourth phase, is it more financial direct capitalization, or is it regulatory tax policy, and with maybe sprinkled with some incentives? Which one will actually make this as much of a V type of curve, where this quarter we're in right now is going to be ugly? It is going to be one of the most brutal quarters in our nation's history. How do you actually, though, have the policies that, as certain states, certain communities, certain industries are beginning to engage in commerce again, that you can also show in those numbers that we have all adopted policies that demonstrate we're coming back. Let me give you an exact example. And one of the calls earlier today, a substantial portion of the call was, you could tell the difference almost ideologically. Part of the call was, we need money for municipalities that are having brutality on their bed tax, on sales tax, on some of their other types of revenues. And then those of us who are saying, we have ideas of things we could do in the tax code that might create almost unleashing some of the animal spirits to come back in. A simple idea. We're all familiar with capital gains tax. Over the recent economic history, there's been a couple times where capital gains taxes were reduced in some ways to have people sell out of their positions, take gain, pay some tax. But those were always tax reductions on gain that had already been recognized or was already on the books. Could you reverse the concept and say, if you're willing to open up your piggy bank this summer, buy assets? We have no idea, you will have no idea if that asset may gain in value. But if it does, a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, you will be subject to a lower or de minimis capital gains rate. So you actually adjust the capital gains trigger date when you buy the asset, not when you sell the asset. Are there ideas like that that don't require a direct appropriation from the Treasury, but actually would get commerce going, people investing in appreciating assets, or at least ones they hope will? How do you come up with a series of tax policies like that? And there's even some things like that on the regulatory side that if someone wants, we can delve into. We need the chambers, particularly one as sophisticated as Phoenix, to help us understand, are there tripwires we're not thinking about? A restaurant in Phoenix has been now closed 6 weeks. Do they have to get a health inspection before they open up again? If you're a manufacturer, do you have to have an air quality engineer look at your scrubbers before you can fire up the facility again? I sort of ask these as these are sorts of things we need to be thinking through, because wouldn't it be heartbreaking to say we're having rules that are safe, that are understandable. We can start to open up these, but we hit bureaucratic barriers, waiting for your inspector to come, waiting for an issuance of a type of permit to come. So we need to think through what would slow us down from moving very quickly. Second thing, the calls we are dealing with as an office, and I think we're really good at this, but sometimes we've been very helpful, sometimes it's been heartbreaking, are those trying to get the payroll protection loans and sort of brokering information as best we can. Sometimes we've actually tried to be a liaison with lenders. Sometimes we've had no luck. But we're doing a very disciplined job. If you actually get our newsletter, if you've ever looked at our website, schweikert.house.gov, I don't think there's anyone doing a better job of the latest information, the simplest way to understand it, one-pagers to be able to walk through. So if you need to understand some of the rules, some of the mechanisms, some of the opportunities, we've put there's a stunning amount of information up very, very quickly. And if there's a question, we have staff that has been remarkably available. The third bucket we'll talk about is what do we do here in Arizona? And how do we be sort of the rational actors in this? If you'd listen to or take a look even at the text messages I've received this morning, I have a handful of folks that are all upset we might be opening certain things, and a whole bunch of folks who are angry we haven't already opened up. If you're a medical provider and the governor now is providing you at least some opportunity, but if there's restrictions that your employees, your patients must have certain types of testing, how do you find those testings? Can the medical provider provide the testing without going and getting a special licensing or permit from the state? Will the state accept that they're licensed in other aspects? Can they actually do the swab, do a blood draw, instead of having to go get another certificate to be able to do that, collect that blood sample, send it to SonoraQuest or whoever may be doing it? Turns out, I'm not sure everyone has thought through some of those sorts of steps. If there's other businesses getting ready to open up, have we provided them information on where they could go get personal protective equipment, proper ways to sanitize a chair, sanitize a table? I think there's very competent groups in our community, the Restaurant Association, others, who are trying to lay out, here's how you print a menu and throw it away. Here's ideas. Here's how you you discourage individuals from having a waiting room. We need to not only just talk about opening or not opening, but if you're going to start to do the incremental opening, how? And how to do it safely. And that's where the chamber, I believe, and our office can be very, very helpful, is resources, information, and then a place to also ask questions, sort of a ombudsman liaison. So that's a bit of my rambling. Let's see if we have some questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I know we're going to want to hear a little bit about sort of the inside baseball that occurred and how you think things will move forward. And I love that you're already thinking about things, for instance, capital gains in a different way. So thank you for that, Congressman. We're going to hear a little bit right now from Jennings from the U.S. Chamber for some brief comments, and then we will come back to you for some questions. So Jennings, take it away.
Great, thanks, Todd. I appreciate it, and thank you, Congressman, as well for your remarks, and thank you for your long-standing support of the business community and a small business in particular, and it's especially important now more so than ever. And so we appreciate that and appreciate the comments that you've made and the points that you've brought up in regards to how to get the economy back open and running again, and how businesses should go about opening up and thinking about kind of the best practices moving forward. And that's certainly a big part of the discussion that we've been seeing, a big internal discussion we've had at the U.S. Chamber, and a discussion that we've had with chambers really across the country is to kind of how to think about moving forward. And we've put together something called a Path Forward initiative as well, that's been kind of headlined by our president, Suzanne Clark. She does calls twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, talking with various folks in all industries and chambers from across the country kind of going through a lot of these issues. I think, you know, on the legal and liability side of things, that's certainly going to be a big concern, and that's getting, I think, a lot more national attention, and that's something that we've been focused on, especially as Congress starts to think about a phase 4 package and what that's going to look like over the next couple of weeks. I think addressing some of these legal liability concerns is going to be huge, and having really kind of federal preemption, right? So seeing something done at the federal level that preempts states from acting on their own, because I think the last thing we want to see is a patchwork of regulations coming out of the states or even local governments. And I think that that kind of thing will lead to, obviously, a lot of confusion, potential litigation issues, but just the fact that the confusion and uncertainty that that would breed would be a huge problem and really prevent a lot of businesses from opening up. So we've been pretty clear on that. We sent a letter working with our chambers of commerce from really all the state chambers across the country. We sent a letter to the National Governors Association, as well as the Mayor's Council, or the Conference of Mayors, talking about the need to kind of come up with uniform guidance and the importance not to convert guidance into regulation. I think guidance is good. I think what we've seen from the CDC and OSHA over the last couple of days has been good and very helpful. And you know, helping businesses and providing kind of the guidelines, the guardrails that businesses need to think about reopening, and what kind of sanitation procedures they need to have in place, and of course social distancing, things like that, PPE. I think that that really helps, and I think that having those guidelines, especially uniform guidelines across the states, will be very helpful. But we want to be careful about not having those guidelines convert into regulations, and especially long-term kind of permanent regulatory changes that, quite frankly, would be, you know, unfeasible to implement for every business in the country. So that's been a big concern of ours. On the Path Forward initiative, I think we've really kind of broken it down into 3 different things that we're thinking about. The first phase is kind of on the screening part and making sure that we're doing sufficient COVID-19 testing. We also have to think about childcare facilities, right? And how they're going to be able to start to take care of children that you know, that are going to need to come into the facility as more and more people go back into the workplace, but schools are still shuttered. So we're going to have to start thinking about what kind of support those childcare facilities are going to require. Same thing for public transportation. As public transportation networks start to go online, and as you start to see more and more people go into them, kind of what they're obviously going to have to be operating with minimal capacity, with social distancing and staggered schedules. So what kind of support is going to be really necessary to get public transportation systems back up and running again to kind of fulfill the needs of a reopening economy. And then, like I said, the regulatory legal liability issues, we've got to think about, you know, health privacy, because I think government, you know, more and more businesses are going to be relied upon to collect health data on their employees and things like that. So there are all kinds of regulatory or legal issues that come up with that. Exposure liability, discrimination claims, installation of personal protective equipment, as well as training of employees for the use of that personal protective equipment, product liability as well for folks that manufacture things like hand sanitizer, for example, or you know, corporate Good Samaritans that are donating PPE equipment and making sure that they're not going to be liable if somebody gets sick in the workplace. So I think these are all things that we're really starting to think about, and we've put together kind of 4 different you know, white papers essentially on these different liability issues. So they're in 4 different tranches, and those are kind of first looking at exposure related claims, you know, for customers and employees, and making sure that we are creating kind of legal safe harbors for businesses to be able to open up. And as long as they're following the guidance from CDC and OSHA and acting in a reasonable, responsible way, they shouldn't be liable for issues, for exposure-related issues. Medical liability as well for healthcare providers, securities litigation that's out there. I know that that's kind of started to be an issue, and we're seeing more litigation on that front. Really kind of looking at that and thinking about, you know, maybe putting a stay for at least 60 days after the expiration of the national emergency declaration until securities litigation can continue to go through, just so businesses aren't kind of, you know, they're already going through a tough enough time as it is. Obviously, we don't want to tack this on. And then the last thing that we're looking at is product liability, kind of as I mentioned, for folks that are manufacturing things like hand sanitizer, because that's not currently covered by the National PrEP Act. for example. So I think that those are kind of the four key areas of liability that we've been looking at. And like I said, federal preemption, I think, is going to continue to be a basic standard, a basic principle that we want to see. We don't want to see a patchwork of regulations. We don't want to see states working on their own. And so that's been a big focus of ours anyway, looking forward. And we're hopeful that these things will be addressed in a phase 4 and give the businesses and the business community the kind of confidence that they need in order to be able to reopen.
Jennings, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Appreciate everything you're doing. And I know that your teams are working with Congressman Schweikert's team as well as our delegation. So we appreciate the remarks. Congressman, thanks again for being with us today. It really is meaningful to have you. I want to go back in time a little bit to when we took our delegation to Washington last year, and you met with us and talked about your support for USMCA and that you were going to fight for that. And you did. And that is that was extremely meaningful, I think, for everyone here in Arizona. So before we get started, I just want to thank you for that. That was instrumental in making sure that we had that passed. And I know it seems like eons ago, but it is absolutely meaningful. So thank you for that. I did get a few questions, and one in particular, the person who wanted me to tell you who he was. So Lynn Kirshner asked a very
Lynn.
a very Schweiker-esque question, I thought, which was, what is your level of concern with the U.S. deficit? And we're talking about phase 4, and of course we've had phase 1 and 2 and 3. What's your concern about the deficit moving forward before we get into any of the other particulars of the stimulus package?
I would say on a scale of 1 to 10 to quote Spinal Tap, it's about an 11. And understand, you see the trillions that have been spent. There will be more deficit that will produce over the next couple of years from the lack of economic velocity than even what we've spent. That's one of the calculations we've been working on the Joint Economic Committee. So if you look at the total cost of this, you see, 2, 3, 4, well, potentially 3.5 trillion that's been coming out, being spent. But we see a number that's closer to 8 going on to the 10-year deficit trillion just from this event. So, and here's our classic problem. We're walking into some very difficult demographic headwinds. We're getting old very, very fast. So structurally, just if everything had stayed normal and we had a really good economy, we were still, by the end of the decade, looking at $2 trillion a year deficits, almost solely driven, matter of fact, almost completely solely driven by our demographics. Social Security, Medicare, the promises, the earned entitlements, the things that are societal promises. And there seems to be a lack of understanding that future deficits were being driven by the fact baby boomers were getting older. Now, when you have a punctuation like we're going through economically, how do you make this as short-lived as possible, get as much of the population working as soon as possible? And then we're going to have even more discussions of, and you got to be careful. There will be those that will immediately say revenues. Maybe, but there's also some cost structures. The vast majority of the next 10 years of deficits is actually healthcare. What are you willing to do that would disrupt healthcare costs? And this is an uncomfortable conversation, but we're actually living a small experiment of it right now with the expansion of telemedicine. And it's a much broader conversation, but I'm a bit of a techno-utopian, believing that there are a number of technologies that could be part of disrupting the current price of healthcare and the immediate future one.
Thank you. Another question from someone you know, Alan McGuire. On balance,
oh, how is Alan?
He's doing great. His question is on balance. It doesn't seem like using federal dollars to assist state and local governments rather than just facilitating the states and local governments borrowing directly. In the past, states and local governments have borrowed money to get through economic slowdowns and then paid it back when times have improved. Is there any chance that such an approach could happen now?
Yeah, this is, and this is becoming a bit of it's beyond a partisan split. It's almost a regional split. Because even in a call earlier today, we had some members of Congress from the Northeast who you could tell in the nature of wanting direct subsidy, but also some of the discussion was, well, we need the direct subsidy. And oh, by the way, any chance we could get a spiff for this next year's contribution to our dramatically underfunded pension systems. It is, you got to understand, there's a huge moral hazard here of states, communities, municipalities that have been disciplined, over the last couple decades, who basically, on occasion had to do that horrible thing for a politician, say no. They get punished. Their taxpayers get punished to cover sort of spending that's happened in other places. So it's a real allocation problem. I fully expect in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see one of those sort of ultimate grab bag type of pieces of legislation that are purely partisan, purely sort of theater to pander to constituencies that will be entered in the House with no intention of it ever even getting looked at in the Senate. So don't panic, but we have a number of our brothers and sisters on the other side who need to satiate a lot of their inbound phone calls. So on occasion, you get these theatrical bills. But McGuire's right. It's in some ways, when you start doing these direct subsidies, you punish the good and subsidize the bad.
Thank you. Well, the next question I think really is something we're hearing from a lot of small business owners in generally, but this particular business owner received a PPP loan, and now it seems like SBA is starting to change the guidance after the fact, and we're hearing that a lot, and certainly a lot of concern about that. What are your thoughts on this? Do you see any further changes as it relates to PPP?
Yes. Well, and to be completely sort of a little more scrupulous, a lot of the guidance just wasn't done. There's money in people's bank accounts before there's even all the rules laid out on what makes it, a grant. And some of that's coming. So far, there's been one or two hiccups, but the guidance coming out of Treasury and SBA have been at least reasonable. It's been a little more difficult for our sole proprietors and some of them on trying to understand. And that's actually one of the things our office has actually been very good at. It's sort of nailing down, what did this guidance mean? Is there a chance there's going to be guidance on the guidance, which has happened a couple times now. So if someone who's received their payroll protection loan and they think one of the guidance is causing them difficulties, reach out, call us. This is just one of the things we're helping with. And on a couple of occasions, we've been able to, shall we say, get a definition that helped. On a couple of occasions, we haven't been able to get a phone call back. So it is a bit hit and miss.
Well, thank you for that. Just for anybody who might have missed it, because you do have a really good website. Could you remind everyone watching what?
Sure.
What
it's just Schweikert, which is a miserable last name for a guy who has to put it on signs. It's SCHWEIKERT.house.gov.
Great. Thank you.
And look, and our office's phone number is 480-946-2411.
Thank you. I'm sure that people will want to use that. Go ahead.
And I think one of the important pieces of guidance too that we'll see hopefully at some point in the next couple of weeks will be on how to go about applying for loan forgiveness as well to your lender. Mm-hmm. So we haven't seen a lot of specifics on that, so we'll be looking for guidance there. That'll be important.
Yeah, and to your point, and we're actually, I think, putting the recording up on our website. On Monday, we actually did a sort of telephone town hall with 3 local CPAs on the phone and had inbound calls saying, here's what we think we know, here's what we don't know, and sort of walking a lot of small businesses through little ideas like open up a separate checking account for those 8 weeks, do this, do that. And I think the chamber should, I would encourage you to do that. We should do it again. But that recording, I believe, is heading up to on our website, where you can actually listen to a discussion with CPAs for free, talking about what we believe we know at this moment on how to make those 8 weeks dischargeable.
Well, we'll link to that. Thank you. I think that is important, and it's just, there's so much out there. There is another question from folks that are watching, and one relates to sort of phase 4. You know, what's the status of a phase 4, and where do you think there'll be some additional phases beyond a 4?
The answer: there will be future phases. A lot of it will be fixing things we've screwed up. I mean, there's a good example, and this one's once again regional. Some parts of the country, what we did on unemployment, the additional $600 a week, is making it very hard to regain attachment from workers to their employers, particularly now those employers who are receiving the payroll protection loan. If you're in a high income, high cost state, if you're in New York or Connecticut, the $600 may have made sense. If you're in Alabama or Arizona or other places, the $600 a week, your much lower cost of living states, it's actually becoming a barrier to workers being able to. They're acting rational, saying I get more money on unemployment. So there's going to be some of those things where we're trying to figure out, are there ways to fix it? Phase 4 is a little more ethereal right now. And my guess is we might be heading into a time where there's sort of dueling pieces of legislation, dueling concepts, one coming out of the White House, one coming out of the Senate, one coming out of the House majority. And my fear is if they're too far of chasms, trying to figure out that middle that really produces that economic velocity back could get a little cantankerous. But you just have to get, that's what we do anymore. Before the virus, as all of you know, our society, we had weaponized politics at every level. Even our bureaucracies had been weaponized. My hopes and prayers that this national crisis would create a reset, so far have been pretty much dashed.
And that certainly is unfortunate. I want to pivot a little bit. I mean, obviously, to your point, this crisis has affected everybody, and certainly those folks who are lower income have been disproportionately affected. And I want to thank you for your work on LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. I think they received $900 million in additional funding in the CARES Act.
And we just did something again on that today, trying to make sure that we can get some more resources, that they understand those of us in the desert Southwest, our cycle is now. We need to deal with that immediately.
But I was going to ask, because clearly that is a big deal. And so it's wonderful to hear that you think it might be possible to do some more on that.
It's not only the more, it's more also in the timing and the allocation and the accessibility. And we actually, I think we're leading, and we're reaching out to the rest of the delegation, asking them to sign on to a letter to sort of deal with those points of, hey, we're in the desert. Our cost cycle is in the summer, not the winter.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit to sort of the science side of this. And you're a person who doesn't mind delving into complicated issues, and you signed on to a letter urging the Department of Health and Human Services to fast track the approval of a potential vaccine. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Okay.
And what we might expect?
Yeah, and this one was also to the FDA.
Got it.
And CDC, and this one has a little bit of an ethical edge to it. Traditional vaccine modeling is random trials, random populations. Some are getting an actual vaccine, some are getting a placebo, and you let nature take its course. And that's always been, it's a highly accurate, but really long, requires fairly large populations to participate. There's been a model out there, and a number of European countries actually do this. Are you willing to reach out to 100, 200, 250 healthy individuals with their full knowledge and say, we're going to give you this vaccine, and then we're going to subject you to the virus? It dramatically shortens up the time. It gives you some highly accurate information on, everything from, antibodies, the titers, everything else you gain. But it's always had a little ethical edge to it. Now, we take these same young people and send them off to war and other things with their knowledge. But it turns out there's some modeling out there that we could dramatically shorten some of the approval data side on approving a vaccine if we're willing to do this. And it's one of those, we all took our bioethics class probably in college. You think about it, and it's one of those, after pondering a bit, a number of us believe it's the ethical thing to do, because if you were to shorten the time down by 6 months, how many lives did you just save from that? So that's the balance you're working through.
Yeah, to your point, it's a tough question, and the stakes are high on both sides. One of the other things, obviously, we're hearing about from healthcare providers and the hospitals is the ability to acquire necessary medical supplies. Can you share some ways that the federal government is helping our providers, our healthcare providers, have the resources necessary to meet the strong need out there?
Yeah, and this is what I hope I'm not inappropriately optimistic on, because if this were 3 weeks ago, we were getting a number of calls from some of our hospitals and certain first responders on their concern that their inventory of PPE, personal protective equipment, was highly stressed. I'm not getting those calls anymore. And we can actually see from the national trackings that production is remarkable. Now it's just the distribution and refilling stockpiles. And I hope actually the fact that those stockpiles are getting refilled becomes part of the formula of being able to do elective procedures again. But it's also going to have to be part of the formula for allowing commerce to begin again. Because it turns out it may be a little uncomfortable, but the server at the restaurant who's coming up to your table may be wearing a mask, may be wearing gloves. Okay, where do they get those? And do they have an adequate supply that they either know how to sterilize or dispose of what they have? So it turns out that supply line becomes critical for not only elective procedures to begin, but also for commerce to open again. We're remarkably better today than we were 10 days ago. And I'm hoping actually as we get to the beginning of next month that we're hearing some optimism that supplies are back.
Well, you put an interesting comment about sort of the uncomfortable nature of what the new normal looks like. One of the tenets of our country is the ability to petition government. What is the new normal going to look like in Congress? How are we going to interact with elected officials, and how are elected officials going to conduct their normal business? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be in person?
It's going to be in person, but it may be with, on occasion, we may be having a meeting where we're not sitting right next to each other in a larger conference room. There may be a number of us wearing masks. I mean, I'm a severe asthmatic. So I'm actually in one of the risk populations. So, when I've had to go out to Costco to, be able to feed the family, I'm wearing a mask. And my little girl tries to wear one, but have you ever tried putting a mask on a 4-year-old? And look, we're going to do things. We're going to sterilize the handrails and the doorknobs and those things. In some ways, they were things we probably should have been doing all along. In even a normal flu season, but we're going to do them a little more compulsively. My bigger concern is actually a derivative of your question, and this one may be more important to the Chamber of Commerce, is what will a shopping center look like in the future? What will a restaurant, how much of their book of business will be people at a table compared to still, going out the door? What will our movie theaters look like? You think through all these things. Have we learned different lifestyle patterns? So even if the velocity of the economy over the next year starts to come back and starts to look much more normal, we all know what was happening to large shopping malls. Did we just accelerate it? We know, and I think those are things we're going to have to think about, that even the trends we knew were coming economically, Will they be, are we going to see them happen much, much faster, either because of consumer choice or being debt ridden? And, it's going to be a mix of things. So trying to get our head around, because that actually ends up, you got to think through those trends even when you're building tax policy, because things are going to change.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And so thinking about the economy, you obviously are a student of government and economic policy. What are the long-term impacts? Is this going to be a sharp and quick type of impact of the economy? Or will it be longer? What are you hearing and what are you seeing?
Oh, I wish I was that good a student. I actually think there's going to be a bit of a psychological, cultural, that both will have some difficulty, but actually might be beneficial. I mean, if you were to go back to the late 80s, all of us who lived through the RTC and what happened to our S&Ls here in the Phoenix area, the amount of our community's leadership that were financially wiped out at the end of the 80s. We spent a decade talking about that. Many of us who were in real estate at that time had bad dreams about it for years. So in a weird way, I actually also see sort of, will there be, if you're a millennial and almost everything you've known in your sort of adult consumption working life has been pretty good. The last few years have been, last couple of years have been amazingly good. And then you deal with this. Does that change your future savings habits, consumption habits, lifestyle habits? And the answer is it's going to. We just don't know to what extent. Long-term wise, the one thing I really think we're going to have to think about is still to come. And this is, we talked about, will there be a phase 4 or phase 5? I can almost guarantee before the end of the year, there will be pieces of legislation to relook at international supply chains. It's going to be a bit China focused, I believe. But items where you're sole sourcing, a pharmaceutical precursor, the ingredients that can only be found in China. I think there'll be a fairly aggressive movement to produce that there must be optionality in those manufacturing and those supply chains. So if USMCA is going online functionally July 1st, how do all of us, because I believe this would truly benefit Arizona, say we have the North American trading bloc now, with Mexico, Canada, the United States, we can build rational arguments that if you're going to make your supply chain more robust, or if there's some things that put actually the nation's health at risk because you're sole sourcing it, how do we get you to bring those back here? And how do I get you to consider the Phoenix area as one of your hubs for that next generation manufacturing? So your cost mechanisms are competitive to differential labor costs. So do we do a tax incentives on advanced manufacturing, in research and development, into moving part of your manufacturing or redesigning your supply chains? Those are areas that both the national chamber and our local chambers really need to get your head around. And it's going to be hard because you're going to have membership who are not thrilled about, 10 years worth of work building a supply chain and then turning around and unwinding part of it. But it's coming. How far the policy goes, I can't tell you, but it is going to come.
Well, some interesting times ahead, and some potentially some strong opportunities for Arizona. So
yes,
good. So I think we're coming up on sort of near the end here, but I do want to focus on opening up. There was another question by Alan about opening up, and certainly it sounds like Governor Ducey is going to make an announcement today. But what would you advise the governor to do in terms of opening back up? What would be your sense for how this should be done, given that there are some economic imperatives and health imperatives?
Look, I actually give Doug credit. I believe his team has done what they can in the environment they have. And my answer is actually not a particularly politically correct one, but I would ignore those of us in the political class, and just use the math. I think the math has shined upon Arizona, and the fact we're 100 degrees outside now, we may even have some more opportunities that we haven't even calculated in yet. So how do you turn to the folks that are losing their minds because they're home, or their hearts are breaking because they're losing their life's work in their businesses, and just both in a rational but empathetic, ethical fashion, say, here are rules that we can live with, that we can start to do commerce. But you got to make them simple. You got to make them understandable. You can't just sort of create something that's ethereal. If you turn tomorrow and said, hair salons can open up, okay. Are you going to provide them an opportunity where they get their personal protective equipment? Are you going to provide them instructions of how you sterilize the chairs, the doorknobs, how to change your scheduling, it's not just enough to say, here's instructions. I believe we're also going to have to help sort of provide some instructions to resources. And I believe that's actually a point where the chamber and some of the different associations need to step up and go someplace they're uncomfortable at. And that is not only providing information and instructions and education, but even helping them produce a supply chain.
Well, thank you for that. And I think you're absolutely correct. The details are going to be so important for business. So thank you for those thoughts. Before we go, I do know that you're obviously involved in a lot. So a month ago, you were looking at a number of items before the elections. Can you just talk about one or two things that you think we also need to focus on outside of COVID-19 as it relates to the session?
I think actually building a working group, and it could be just a video conference like this, where you talk through saying, let's all pretend we're sitting here and it's August. It's July, it's September. What do things look like? And what do we have to do to get to that sort of an optimistic view? And I sort of threw this out earlier, but I really want it to be thought about because I hear no one else saying these things. Are there things in the rules, in the bureaucracies, in the litigation exposure that are going to slow us down? What do we do at the state level, the local level, even, and for those at the national level, to avoid those pitfalls? So like the example I gave you, I don't actually know if it's true in Arizona, but it apparently is true in some states, where if you shut your restaurant down for more than a month, you have to have an inspector come in before you can start to fire up the business again. Well, what if every restaurant in Phoenix decided they were opening up next Tuesday? And that was one of the rule sets here. They're not opening until the inspector comes. We need to know what's our fragility. Are there things, what are the unexpected consequences? Can we do some research so they're expected? Is that making sense? So it's not enough to sort of build a plan unless you've really thought through who's going to be throwing up roadblocks. Are we going to have some of our trial bar starting to paper workers saying, hey, if you get sick, we want to sue someone for you? We need to think that through and build plans so those things don't happen.
Well, certainly that hopeful perspective, I think, is so key right now. So thank you. I think we saw it after September 11th. Love to see at least that sort of attitude and the idea that we're going to overcome again. Another final question for you as we wrap up. Obviously a lot on your mind. What keeps you awake at night, and then what gives you hope in the morning to get out of bed and you look at your daughter and think about her future? What
keeps me up at night is excessive amounts of caffeine. And what gets me up in the morning is I have a 4-year-old that won't sleep in her own bed. So, look, to be completely honest, and McGuire's known me since I was a much, much younger man. I'm a worrywart. I worry about everything. But you try to find a balance of, you manage the things you can. You have to accept that this is a moment where we desperately need to be coming together in an environment where lots of folks have sort of acculturated their brain to see everything through a lens of disharmony, if not partisanship. And we just have to accept that. We have to just grind through it. But those folks who are being irrational, and this is going to be really hard for the governor, those folks who are, living on the data set, the information they had a month ago, well, that's not true anymore. And everything we know today will be different tomorrow. Can we build a support base when those who are around us, or even those of us who sometimes have to make audible calls policy-wise, that when we're doing things that are rational, that are good for the populace and good for the economics, and that the chambers of the world and the people around us, you come and help us tell the story we're doing the right thing, and not be passive observers as the bludgeoning begins.
Well, good perspective, and certainly marching orders for us. I think I appreciate you talking about the importance of chambers. We feel like we're adding a lot to the conversation. So,
yes.
But I do want to thank you. I don't know if I was actually a page back in the 90s when you were at the legislature, so I've known you for a long time.
What year were you a page?
1995.
You were there during some very interesting times.
I think you were the whip, yeah. And so it's been nice, obviously, to know you through the years and watch how you have gone from the state to the federal level.
A terrifying thing. I was a page for a short time for a guy named Bob Usdane.
Yep.
In the early 80s, when they were doing Access. And here I am all these years later, and I do Medicare financing and Medicaid financing issues in Congress, and I still have the ghosts of those early 80s still in front of me. So
I think we're all suffer from that affliction. I want to thank you, Congressman, for your time, for your leadership, for being with us today. We really appreciate it. I hope people will go to your site, call your office. We'll also link to the webinar that you did with the CPAs. Thank you for that. I want to thank Renee and Jennings for joining us, as well as thanking our sponsors, APS, SRP, and Fennemore Craig as well. So have a great day, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.